The app's glow was a small, lonely fire in the dark of Mira's apartment. It was late, the hour when the city's breath slowed to a whisper, and the only things still moving were ghosts, ambulances, and people who couldn't sleep. Mira was one of the latter. She swiped left on a man flexing in a bathroom mirror, left on a bio that was just a string of emojis she suspected was either a marriage proposal or a ransom demand, left on a photo of a man holding a large fish as if it were a recently vanquished foe. Congratulations, she thought. You have defeated a salmon. What a provider. Then she paused. The profile was simple, the photo understated. A man sitting on the edge of a fountain, the stone dark with night and water. He wasn't smiling for the camera, but looking off to the side, a faint, wry curve to his lips, as if he'd just heard a joke no one else could. The background was blurred, but it looked old. European, maybe. He was handsome in a way that wasn't immediate or overwhelming. It was in the structure of his face, the line of his jaw. He looked settled, like a man who knew exactly who he was and was mildly amused by the fact. The bio was 4 short lines. Night owl, old soul, looking for someone real. Warning, I take coffee dates very seriously. Mira's thumb hovered over the screen. It was the old soul that got her. She knew it was a cliché, a tired line trotted out by 20-somethings who liked vinyl records and called themselves sapiosexual. But on this profile, next to that face, it felt different. Less like a posture and more like a statement of fact. She was a historical archivist. She spent her days handling the brittle paper ghosts of people long dead, trying to piece together their realness from the faint ink of their signatures. She had a professionally trained instinct for authenticity, and something about this profile pinged it. She swiped right. A match, instant. A message appeared a second later, the text clean and without flourish. Damien. I'm glad we agree on the important things. Mira typed back, a small smile playing on her lips. And what would those be? That it's far too late for this, and yet here we are. She laughed, a quiet puff of sound in her silent apartment. Some of us are night owls. So I see. Coffee, then? To prove my seriousness. It was bold, but his profile had warned her. It's almost 2 a.m, Damien. I know a place that never closes. And I find the best conversations happen when the rest of the world is asleep. Mira hesitated for only a moment. Her life was a carefully curated collection of quiet days and predictable evenings. She catalogued the past. She didn't make a habit of creating a chaotic present. But something about this felt different. It was the pull of the unknown, the same quiet thrill she got when she opened a box of unread letters from a forgotten diplomat. It was the promise of a story. Okay, Damien, she typed. Show me how serious you are. Damien read her reply on the balcony of his penthouse. The city lights spread below him like a fallen constellation. He did not feel the cold. He never felt the cold, not in the way humans did. For him, it was simply an absence of heat, a data point his body registered and promptly ignored. He held the phone in his hand, a sleek black rectangle of glass and light that still, after all these years, struck him as both miraculous and slightly absurd. He remembered a time when sending a message across a city required a horse, a boy, and a significant risk of dysentery. You are not, I hope, actually entertaining this, a voice said from the doorway. Damien didn't turn. He knew the sound of Julian's footsteps the way a sailor knows the tide. He'd known them for 350 years. I am, Damien said, his gaze on the river below. I have a coffee date. Julian stepped onto the balcony. He was leaner than Damien, his edges sharper, his stillness less a state of peace and more a coiled readiness that had never quite demobilized. He'd been a soldier in life, and he had never entirely ceased to be one in death. With immortal, from a matchmaking application. Julian said the words the way a sommelier might say boxed wine. It's how they meet now, Julian. The world changes. We do not. That is rather the point. Julian clasped his hands behind his back. Is this truly wise, my lord? After all this time, to invite randomness? Lord. Damien resisted the urge to sigh. It was a title he had worn for centuries, a mantle of responsibility that had long ago fused to his skin. He was a king, not of a country, but of a court. A hidden, nocturnal kingdom of survivors and predators, held together by his will, his reputation, and a network of alliances as ancient and tangled as the roots of a yew tree. It was, essentially, the world's most dangerous homeowners association, and he had been president for 500 years without a single vote of thanks. And it was lonely. A profound, bone-deep loneliness that centuries had only deepened. His kind made alliances. They forged bonds of necessity and loyalty. They did not, as a rule, make friends. And they certainly didn't find love. Not the real kind. Not the kind that wasn't born of power dynamics and the grim arithmetic of shared immortality. Wisdom has kept me alive, Julian, Damien said quietly. It has not, however, made me happy. He looked down at the phone, at Mira's name. I want to have a conversation with someone who doesn't know what I am. Someone whose laughter isn't tinged with 2 centuries of shared grievances. I want to be surprised. Julian was silent for a long moment. He had the particular stillness of a man who disagreed entirely, but had decided, after 3.5 centuries of practice, that saying so was a waste of calories. And if she is surprising, what then? You know the math of these things. The math, the brutal, unforgiving arithmetic of immortality. Everyone you love will die, and you will remember all of them. He had learned that lesson in his first century, and the scar it left had never fully faded. It's coffee, Julian, not a proposal of eternal fealty. That is what you said about Vienna, Julian murmured, and about Constantinople before that. Constantinople was not my fault. Constantinople was entirely your fault, my lord. Damien typed a reply to Mira, sending her the address of a 24-hour diner downtown, a place of bright fluorescent lights and cracked vinyl booths he'd been frequenting since the Eisenhower administration. Neutral territory. Human territory. Be careful, Julian said, his voice softer now. The world has changed, yes, but the dangers have not. Damien slipped the phone into his pocket. The most dangerous thing on this earth, Julian, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, is hope. Julian watched him go. Then he picked up his own phone, which he held the way one might hold a live grenade, and Googled, "What is a coffee date?" The results were not reassuring. The diner was an island of jarring light and the smell of old coffee and frying onions. It was mostly empty. A few truckers, a couple of students hunched over laptops, and one elderly man who appeared to be having a deeply personal conversation with a slice of pie. Mira spotted Damien immediately. He was in a booth in the back, nursing a black coffee he hadn't touched. He looked exactly like his photo, but the stillness was more pronounced in person. It wasn't the calm of a relaxed man. It was the absolute, unnerving composure of something very old, pretending to be casual, like a cathedral trying to pass as a coffee shop. Professional assessment, the archivist part of her brain noted. Subject presents with unusual poise. Cross-reference with diplomats, surgeons, people who are lying about something. When he saw her, his eyes met hers across the room, and the focus in them was so intense it felt physical, like a hand on her arm. A slow smile spread across his face, and the unsettling composure dissolved into something else. Charm. Genuine, disarming charm. He stood as she approached, actually stood, from the booth, as if she were arriving at a state dinner and not a fluorescent-lit diner at 2 a.m. Mira, I'm Damien. His voice was low, smoother than she'd imagined. You're real, she said, sliding into the booth. The vinyl was cool against her legs. I try to be. He sat down opposite her. Up close, his eyes were a strange, dark hazel, almost black in the diner's harsh light. And there was something about them, a depth that didn't match the unlined skin around them. Like looking at a building that was clearly old, but had been recently replastered. Provenance uncertain, her brain supplied. Warrants further investigation. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know it was an unusual request." "I'm an archivist," she said, picking up the menu she had no intention of ordering from. "I'm professionally obligated to be interested in the unusual. It's basically in the job description, right after must own at least 3 cardigans. The waitress arrived, a woman whose face was a roadmap of long nights and short patience. Mira ordered a coffee. Damien just gestured to his own untouched cup. Data point 1, her brain noted. Ordered coffee he isn't drinking. Possible, not thirsty. Also possible, prop. An archivist, he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a strange, careful precision, as if he'd learned it in a different century and was making sure the pronunciation hadn't shifted. You work with the past. I try to keep it from being forgotten, she corrected gently. People think history is about big events, wars, and treaties, but it's not. It's about people. Their grocery lists, their love letters, their tax records, the small, real things they leave behind. He leaned forward, his focus unwavering. And he began to listen. Not the way most dates listened, the performative lean-in, the preloaded response waiting behind their eyes. He listened with an unnerving, flattering intensity, as if her thoughts on the preservation of 19th century correspondence were the most fascinating thing he had encountered in recent memory. Which, given how old he turned out to be, was saying something. He asked questions, smart questions that showed he wasn't just hearing her words, but understanding the architecture behind them. And Mira found herself talking more than she usually did, spilling out anecdotes about her work, her frustrations with budget cuts, the quiet joy of discovering a hidden detail in a forgotten diary. An hour bled into 2. The diner emptied out, the truckers left, the students packed up. The elderly man finished his conversation with the pie and departed, apparently satisfied with its counsel. At some point, Mira noticed his coffee cup was still full, still black. He hadn't taken a single sip. Data point 2. The coffee is definitely a prop. They brushed hands when she reached for a sugar packet. His skin was cold. Not just cool, but cold. Like marble that had been sitting in a cellar. The touch was brief, accidental, but the temperature difference was so stark it sent a jolt up her arm. He pulled his hand back a fraction too quickly. "You're cold," she observed, keeping her voice casual. "I run cold," he said. His smile didn't change, but something behind it did, a door closing. Data point 3. Subject runs cold the way Antarctica runs cold. She filed it away. The untouched coffee, the strange, unblinking focus, the temperature of old stone. It didn't add up to anything she could name yet, but the file was open. As the first hint of gray began to soften the black sky outside, he glanced at the window. A subtle tension entered his posture, the first crack in his composure all night. "It's almost dawn," he said. "I should let you get some rest." Data point 4. Concerned about dawn. He walked her to her car. The air was cool and clean, washed by the night. "I enjoyed this, Mira," he said, and meant it. "Me too." She paused, then decided to match his earlier boldness. "So, second date?" His smile returned, warm and genuine. "I was hoping you'd ask. There's a new exhibit at the museum, the artifacts of the Silk Road. They have special nighttime hours on Thursday." "Sounds perfect," she said. An old soul and a museum. It fit. The archivist in her was delighted. The woman in her was intrigued. The part of her brain that kept the file open simply added another data point and waited. He didn't move to hug her or kiss her. He just gave a small, almost formal nod. "Until Thursday, then." She watched him walk away, his figure swallowed by the pre-dawn shadows with a speed that seemed, if she was being honest, not entirely natural. Data point 5. Moves like the shadows are his natural habitat. She got into her car, started the engine, and sat there for a moment. He's either a serial killer, she said to her steering wheel, or something significantly weirder. She considered this. I'm going back either way, so I suppose it doesn't matter. The museum was a cavern of hushed echoes and carefully controlled light. The second date was better than the first, which Mira hadn't thought possible, because the first date had set the bar at best conversation I've had with a human being in possibly my entire life, and she was not a woman who graded on a curve. Damien moved through the Silk Road exhibit not as a tourist, but as a connoisseur. He pointed out the subtle imperfections in a 14th century ceramic pot, explaining the firing techniques of the region with an authority that was absolutely not on the museum's placards. He stood before a display of desiccated spices, cinnamon, cloves, star anise, and described the scent of the markets in Samarkand with such vivid specificity that Mira stopped walking. You know a lot about this, she said, her voice slightly too loud in the quiet hall. It's a personal interest, he replied, his gaze on a bolt of silk whose color had faded to the shade of a pale ghost. Some things are worth remembering in detail. Remembering, not studying, not reading about, remembering. She added it to the file. He paused in front of a glass case containing a merchant's personal effects. A small brass compass, a leather pouch, a bone-handled knife worn smooth by decades of use. These belong to someone real, he said quietly, and there was a tenderness in his voice that went deeper than academic interest. Someone who carried them every day, who touched them so often his hands wore grooves into the leather. That's exactly what I think, Mira said, surprised. That's exactly why I do what I do. He looked at her, and for a moment, the mask, the charming, composed, modern man mask, slipped. Underneath was something much older, much more tired, and much more beautiful. Someone who had been carrying his own worn grooves for a very long time. Then he recovered, the mask sliding back into place so smoothly she almost doubted she'd seen beneath it. The High Renaissance exhibit is through there, he said lightly, though, frankly, a bit overrated. So much drama, not enough substance. He'd just reviewed the Renaissance, Mira thought, like it was a restaurant with pretentious plating. She made a mental note. Data point 7. Grades historical periods with the confidence of a man who was there for the opening night. Their third date was dinner, or it was supposed to be. They went to a small new Italian place she'd wanted to try. The air was thick with the scent of garlic and oregano. The moment they stepped inside, Damien flinched. A barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, a flicker in his eyes. He recovered in an instant, but she saw it. They were seated, and when the waiter brought a basket of warm garlic bread, Damien shifted his chair back. A subtle movement. Someone who wasn't watching for it wouldn't have noticed. Mira was watching for it. He didn't eat. He ordered a dark red wine, which he swirled in his glass with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing man enjoying a drink for a very long time, but never actually drank. He talked, he listened, he was as charming as ever, but Mira's mind was working, cross-referencing data points with the ruthless efficiency of someone who indexed documents for a living. Data point 8. Garlic aversion, physical, not preference. Data point 9. Does not eat. Data point 10. Does not drink, unless you count the wine he is using as a very expensive hand prop. She watched him over the rim of her own glass. No food, aversion to garlic, nocturnal habits, skin the temperature of a wine cellar, a knowledge of history that felt less academic and more testimonial. The way he dismissed the Renaissance, so much drama, had sounded less like a critical opinion and more like a personal review. 1 star, would not attend again. The file in her head was getting thick, and the conclusion it was pointing toward was absolutely, categorically insane. It was something from books and movies. It was something a rational, professionally trained archivist would never, ever entertain as a serious hypothesis. She entertained it anyway. She was, after all, a woman who had once identified a previously unknown letter from Napoleon's valet based on the watermark in the paper. She trusted her pattern recognition. Working hypothesis, she thought. And then thought the rest of it, and then thought, well, that's a new one. On their 4th date, she set her trap. She chose the location, the same 24-hour diner, back to where it started. The fluorescent lights were just as harsh, the coffee just as burnt. Damien sat opposite her, his untouched cup a familiar fixture between them. She had upgraded it in her file from prop to costume piece. Mira let the silence stretch, watching him. He met her gaze, patient, waiting. He was always waiting. She supposed that when you'd been alive for, well, however long, waiting became less of an activity and more of a default state. She stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. I have a theory, she said, her voice even. I'm listening, he said. She took a breath. She could be wrong. She could be about to sound like a complete lunatic and scare off the most interesting man she had ever met. But her gut, the same instinct that told her which brittle document was about to crumble in her hands, which faded signature was genuine and which was forged, was practically vibrating. You don't eat, you don't drink, except for wine you also don't drink. You run cold like a walk-in freezer in a suit. You have an encyclopedic first-person knowledge of history that goes back several centuries. You flinched when we walked into a restaurant that smelled of garlic. She laid out the evidence one by one, like artifacts on a display table. Clean, organized, properly sourced. She looked him directly in the eye. You're a vampire. The silence that followed was, in Mira's professional opinion, the loudest silence she had ever heard. Damien stared at her. 500 years of composure, 5 centuries of masks and adaptations and careful, calculated blending, all of it buckled. His eyes went wide. The color drained from his already pale face, leaving his skin the shade of parchment. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, completely and utterly derailed. He had prepared for this moment. He'd run 100 scenarios through his centuries-old mind. He'd expected screaming. He'd expected horror. He'd expected the crash of a coffee mug and the sight of her running for the door. He had a contingency plan involving a mild bit of misdirection and a graceful retreat. He did not have a contingency plan for quiet, methodical accusation over diner coffee, delivered with the calm authority of a woman presenting findings at an academic conference. What, he finally managed, his voice a rasp, gave it away. Mira nearly laughed. You rated the Renaissance 1 star like you'd been to the opening. He closed his eyes. A hand came up to pinch the bridge of his nose, a gesture so human, so tired, that it made her chest ache. I was there, he admitted, and it was overrated. He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked at her. He was bracing himself, waiting for the fear to land, waiting for her to get up, to throw her coffee at him, to run. That was the pattern. He knew the pattern. Instead, Mira took a sip of her coffee. Her heart was hammering. He could hear it from across the table, a frantic staccato he could have picked out from 1,000 others, but her hand was steady. She set the cup down with a small, deliberate clink. So the old soul thing was literal, she said. Very. And night owl? The ghost of his old humor flickered in his eyes. Medically necessary. And then she laughed, a real, genuine, full laugh that filled the space between them and made the waitress glance over from the counter. It was a sound of pure, surprised delight. She had built the case, presented the evidence, reached the conclusion, and the conclusion was absurd, and she was laughing at the sheer, magnificent absurdity of it. He stared at her, mesmerized. In 500 years, no one had ever laughed. The laughter faded to a grin. "Okay," she said, leaning forward, her expression bright with the particular intensity of a researcher who has just been handed the most extraordinary primary source of her career. "I have questions." Relief hit him like a tide. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in so long he'd forgotten what it felt like, the physical unwinding of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying in his jaw, his shoulders, his hands. His whole body had been clenched around the expectation of rejection, and she had responded with curiosity. "I have centuries of answers," he said, his voice thick with something he couldn't name. "Good," she said, flagging the waitress, "because I'm going to need significantly more coffee." She did have questions. She had, in fact, prepared them. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, and Damien saw, with a mix of horror and delight, that she had a numbered list. "You made a list?" "I'm an archivist, Damien. I don't walk into primary source interviews unprepared." She scrolled. Question 1. Sunlight. Fatal. His tone was matter-of-fact. Not in a dramatic puff of smoke, more like the world's most severe allergy, degenerative, painful. Think of it as radiation poisoning on an accelerated timeline. She was taking notes. She was actually typing into her phone. He watched her thumbs move and felt a complicated emotion he eventually identified as being utterly charmed. Question 2. The coffee. Decorative. I knew it. Question 3. Food in general. Unnecessary and, in most cases, unpleasant. I can force it down if the social situation demands it, but it's the equivalent of you eating a decorative candle. That is extremely specific, and I appreciate the comparison. She typed. Question 4. How old? 512. Mira's thumb stopped. She looked up at him over the top of her phone. You're 500. And 12. Damien, I handle documents from the 1800s. With cotton gloves and climate-controlled storage. You are older than the documents I handle with cotton gloves and climate-controlled storage. She stared at him. You are a primary source. Do you understand what you are? You're walking, talking provenance. You are every historian's fever dream. That is not how most people react. Most people aren't archivists. She went back to her list. Question 5, actually, skip to 7, this is the important one. The cold skin. Is that constant? Yes. Can you warm up? Like, hypothetically, if you held a hot coffee long enough, the coffee would get cold. I would stay the same. So you're essentially a very attractive refrigerator. He considered this. I have never been compared to a kitchen appliance before. In 500 years. That is a genuine first. You're welcome. Question 12. You skipped 8 through 11. I'm saving them. Question 12. Do you sleep? A form of dormancy. A few hours during daylight. It's less sleep and more standby mode. Like a computer that's technically off, but will turn on if you bump the mouse. Another appliance metaphor. We're building a theme. She set her phone down and looked at him, and her expression changed. The researcher softened into the woman. How long has it been since you told someone? The question was simple. The answer was not. A long time, he said. Decades. And it didn't end like this. How did it end? Badly, he said. They always do. She was quiet for a moment, reading him the way she read old letters. Not the words themselves, but the spaces between them, the things the writer couldn't say. I'm not going to end badly, Damien. He wanted to believe her. The wanting was a physical ache, a crack in the foundation of 5 centuries of learned caution. You say that now. I say that as a professional who has spent her entire career determining what's genuine and what's forged. She held his gaze. And you are the most genuine thing I have ever encountered, including the Napoleon letter. And I want you to know that is an extremely competitive category. The relationship after the reveal was, and Mira searched for the right word, logistically insane. He couldn't do daytime, any daytime. Not brunch, not farmers markets, not the Sunday afternoon hike her coworker Sandra kept insisting would change her life. Sandra, Mira reflected, would have to remain unaware that Mira's new boyfriend was allergic to the sun in a way that wasn't metaphorical, and that the hike would, in fact, end his life. My friends want to meet you, Mira said one evening, sitting cross-legged on his sofa, eating takeout from a container because his kitchen was a library. An actual library. Where the stove should have been, there was a first edition of Frankenstein. She had feelings about this. I would be delighted, Damien said, from the armchair where he was reading a history of the Ottoman Empire and periodically muttering corrections at it. When? Saturday brunch. The silence was eloquent. Right, she said. Not brunch. Dinner? After sunset, which in June is approximately 9:30 at night. I can be flexible. Damien, you literally cannot be flexible. The sun is not a scheduling preference. It is your kryptonite. Superman is fictional, Mira, and yet somehow less complicated to date. This became the problem. Not the only one, but the most daily one. Their schedules were photographic negatives of each other. She worked 9 to 5 in a building full of windows and fluorescent optimism. He existed in the dark hours, the margins of the day. Their overlap was a narrow band of twilight in the evening and the small hours before dawn. Every date was a nocturnal expedition. Every morning goodbye had a hard deadline written in the sky. She learned to nap after work. He learned to get up earlier, which for a vampire meant waking at sunset instead of full dark, the equivalent of a human setting their alarm for 4 a.m. and meaning it. He did this without complaint, and she noticed, and the noticing mattered more than the gesture itself. He also, and this was the thing that undid her, learned to cook. Not for himself, he couldn't eat, but he spent 3 weeks teaching himself to make her favorite pasta from a recipe he'd memorized in Naples in 1743, adjusting it for modern ingredients, tasting nothing, relying entirely on her reactions to know if he'd gotten it right. The first attempt was, by her diplomatic assessment, ambitious. The second was better. The third made her cry, which alarmed him considerably until she explained that they were good tears, the kind you get when someone has done something so specifically, unnecessarily kind that your body doesn't know how else to respond. You can't even taste it, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. No, he said, watching her eat with an expression of quiet, focused satisfaction. But I can watch you taste it. That's better. She decided at that moment that she was in love with him. Not because of the pasta, because of the watching. Because he had found a way to feed her that cost him nothing physically and everything emotionally, and he had done it without being asked. Julian, who had been monitoring the situation with the quiet intensity of a man watching a slow-moving natural disaster, had also been handling the quarterly territorial review, 2 feeding rights disputes in the eastern districts, and a formal grievance from a 300-year-old countess who believed her blood bank allocation had been unfairly reduced. He handled all of this without complaint, because he had been handling Damien's administrative overflow since the Reformation, and because he understood that his king was, at the present moment, functionally useless. He appeared in Damien's doorway one evening, holding Damien's phone at arm's length. It made a sound, Julian said. A chirping sound. I believe the mortal has sent you a small yellow face. It's an emoji, Julian. It is an abomination. He set the phone on the table the way one might set down evidence at a crime scene. There are also moons, bats, a question mark. I am choosing to interpret this as a threat. She's asking if I'm free tonight. You have survived 5 centuries, 3 plagues, and Constantinople, which was your fault, and you are now conducting a courtship through small yellow faces. Emoji. I know what they're called. He straightened his cuffs. Car, or will you be flying on the wings of the small yellow bat? Damien picked up his phone. The message was, Free tonight? Want to come over? I made too much pasta and my apartment is sad without you in it. Followed by a moon, a bat, and a tiny garlic emoji with a red X through it. He showed Julian the garlic emoji. Julian looked at it for a long time. She is mocking your condition, Julian observed. She's teasing, Damien corrected, smiling. There's a difference. The difference, Julian said, turning to leave, is that you enjoy it, which is worse. The intimacy was harder than the logistics, not the emotional kind. That was surprisingly easy. They talked for hours, every night, about everything. He told her about centuries she'd only read about, and she told him about the daily, textured reality of being alive right now, which turned out to be the thing he was most hungry for. Not her blood, her present. The way she described the specific annoyance of a delayed train, the smell of the coffee cart outside the archive on a cold morning, the stupid thing her coworker said, the small, disposable, utterly human details that he had stopped noticing in his own existence decades ago. Tell me about today, he would say, and she'd describe finding a misfiled letter from 1847 and the quiet triumph of returning it to its proper folder. And he would listen as if she were describing the discovery of a new continent. The physical intimacy was where it got complicated. The first time she kissed him, really kissed him, not the careful, tentative thing from their 5th date. She pressed her warm mouth against his cold one and felt the exact moment he stopped breathing. Not because he was overwhelmed, because he had stopped the performance. The constant, subtle rise and fall of his chest that he maintained around her, so practiced, so habitual that she usually forgot it was fake, simply ceased. As if all his processing power had been redirected. You stopped breathing, she murmured against his lips. I don't need to breathe, he said, his voice rough. I do it for you, so you don't notice. I noticed. You notice everything. It's extremely inconvenient. She kissed him again, and this time she felt his hands on her waist, and they were cold, and she didn't flinch, and the not flinching undid something in him. A tiny, almost inaudible sound escaped his throat, not hunger, not desire, just the raw, startled noise of a man who had not been touched with warmth in a very long time. But he was careful, always careful. He held her like she was made of something that could break. Not porcelain, she thought, but more like one of her archive documents, something precious and irreplaceable, and temporary in a way that terrified him. You can hold me harder than that, she said one night, her head against his chest, listening to the silence where a heartbeat should have been. I'm not going to crumble. I know, he said, but his arms didn't tighten. Damien. The thing you have to understand, he said carefully, is that I am always aware of your pulse. Always. Right now, it's 68 beats per minute, resting, calm. When you kissed me a moment ago, it went to 91. He paused. I know the exact speed of your blood at every moment. I know when it quickens. I know when it slows. And I am always having to, not respond to that information the way my body wants to. She was quiet for a long moment. What does your body want to do? Get closer, he said, and the honesty of it stripped the word of anything clinical. Always closer. The hunger is not separate from the rest of what I feel. It's woven into it. When I want to be near you, Part of that wanting is this. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the reality of what he was. And I can't always tell where the wanting ends and the hunger begins. So I stay careful, because the alternative is finding out the hard way. She considered this. So what you're telling me is that your love language is also, technically, your dinner language. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. I am going to choose not to respond to that. Because I'm right. Because you are appallingly right, and I need a moment. She laughed, and the laugh turned into something softer, and she pressed her face against his shoulder. The alternative, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt, is trusting yourself. I've been trusting myself for 500 years. I've never had this much to lose. She didn't push. She laid her head back against the silence of his chest and listened to the nothing where his heart should be, and thought, he's not afraid of hurting me. He's afraid of wanting to. She decided he needed to experience something of her world. Not the archives, not the past, the simple, mundane present. She took him to a sprawling, labyrinthine used bookstore that stayed open late. The place was a chaotic cathedral of paper and dust. Books stacked in precarious towers, crammed into shelves, spilling onto the floor. For Mira, it was heaven. For Damien, it was an olfactory experience so rich he had to pause in the doorway and recalibrate. 14 different types of paper decay, he said, 3 kinds of binding glue, 2 mice, and someone is eating a sandwich in the back room. You're like a wine person, but for decomposition, Mira said. I choose to take that as a compliment. He moved through the narrow aisles with a careful, deliberate grace, his long coat brushing against stacks of paperbacks. She watched him, amused. He was trying so hard to seem normal. He'd put his hands in his pockets. He was doing the breathing thing, the slow, practiced rise and fall of his chest. He'd even manufactured a small, unnecessary cough. He was performing Man in a Bookstore, and it was, frankly, adorable. He stopped in the history section. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume on the Napoleonic Wars. He opened it, and the performance fell away. The pocketed hands came out. The manufactured breathing stopped. The real Damien surfaced, the one who had been there, who had seen it, who carried the weight of it. They always get the mud wrong, he murmured. The mud? The retreat from Moscow, he said, his gaze distant. The chroniclers write about the snow, the cold. They never capture the mud that came after, the sheer, soul-crushing reality of it. It smelled of death and black powder and something worse. It pulled your boots off. It swallowed cannons. He looked up at her, and for a second, the 21st century bookstore faded away, and she saw a man who had stood on a frozen plain and watched an empire die. He caught himself. The mask slid back. He closed the book, shelved it. Fascinating period, he said lightly. You were there, Mira said, not a question. I was many places. Damien, you just described the mud like it personally offended you. It did. I was wearing very good boots. She stared at him. He stared back, perfectly composed. She burst out laughing, and the sound bounced off the walls of books, and an annoyed shh came from somewhere in the poetry section. I'm dating a man who is personally aggrieved by Napoleonic mud, she whispered. This is my life now. Your life, he said, with a flicker of that old wry smile, has become significantly more interesting. Debatable. I was already pretty interesting. You were. That's why I swiped right. And then, because the universe had decided that this particular evening needed a dramatic turn, Mira reached for her bag, and a thin, sharp-edged piece of archival cardstock she'd forgotten was in there slipped out and sliced a clean, deep line across the back of her hand. Ow! She hissed. Blood welled up instantly, bright, shocking, red. The world stopped. For Damien, it was not a metaphor. Everything, the cheerful clerk humming behind the counter, the rustle of pages, the distant traffic, vanished. The air, which had smelled of old paper and dust, was suddenly filled with one scent: iron, salt, life. Her life. It hit him like a wall, like a sound, like a chord struck on an instrument that resonated at the exact frequency of his hunger. His throat tightened, a painful, constricting spasm. His carefully practiced breathing ceased, not by choice this time. The sounds of the room sharpened to painful clarity. He could hear the frantic acceleration of her heart. He could hear the whisper-soft sound of blood meeting air. The hunger, the chronic condition he managed with tasteless, sterile rations, was no longer background noise. It was a physical, screaming presence. White-hot, absolute. Every nerve he had narrowed to a single point: her hand. The red, the scent. He took a step back, then another. His movements were stiff, mechanical. The grace was gone. "Damien?" Mira's voice, small and concerned. She was looking at him, her bleeding hand forgotten. She saw the change, the color draining from his face. His eyes wide, pupils blown so dark they swallowed the hazel entirely. He looked like a man fighting a war inside his own body, because he was. He could not speak. The words were trapped behind the knot of hunger in his throat. 500 years of control, 5 centuries of discipline, and a paper cut was going to be the thing that broke it. Paper cut, some distant, sardonic corner of his mind observed. You survived the fall of Constantinople, and a paper cut is going to be your undoing. Julian was right. This is entirely your fault. He turned and walked out of the bookstore. Not with his full speed, that would have been inhuman, literally, but fast enough that the clerk stared after him with a bewildered expression, and Mira was left standing alone by the counter, her hand bleeding onto a copy of Leaves of Grass. The silence in the bookstore was a physical thing. The clerk, a young man with blue hair and a Kafka tattoo, was staring at the door. Is he okay? Mira looked down at her hand. The cut was clean and still weeping red. She looked at the door. She thought about his face in that last moment, the terror in it. Not anger, not violence. Terror. He had been afraid. Not of her, of himself. Professional assessment, her brain supplied, because it didn't know how to stop. Subject experienced acute physiological distress triggered by the presence of blood. Fled to prevent escalation. The danger was internal, not directed. He removed himself from the situation to protect the source of the trigger. Conclusion. The subject is in crisis, and the crisis is that he is in love with someone whose biology is a constant threat to his self-control. He's fine, she told the clerk. Do you have a first aid kit? He did. As she bandaged her hand, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She thought about him out there, alone in the dark, fighting something she couldn't see and couldn't help with. He hadn't run from her. He had run for her. She typed 3 words. Simple, enormous. Are you okay? Damien stood on a rooftop 10 blocks away, the wind tearing at his coat. He was shaking. Not from cold. He never shook from cold. But from the violent, receding tide of the hunger. He could still taste it on the back of his tongue, a coppery ghost that made his gums ache with a need so specific it was almost a sound. He should end it. The thought arrived with the clean, terrible clarity of a diagnosis. The paper cut was a preview. There would be more: kitchen accidents, scraped knees, a bitten lip. 1,000 small, ordinary moments where her blood met air, and he would have to win every single time. The thought of leaving her was a pain located somewhere behind his sternum, where a heartbeat used to be. His phone vibrated. He almost didn't look. He expected anger or fear, or the kind of carefully worded goodbye that people compose when they are trying to be kind about something devastating. Are you okay? 3 words. He stared at them. The rooftop wind pulled at his coat, and he stood there, holding a phone that weighed nothing and contained a message that weighed everything. Are you okay? Not, what happened? Not, you scared me. Not, I think we should talk. Just, are you okay? After what he had just revealed, after the mask had slipped and the thing underneath had shown its teeth, her first thought was for him. The last person who had asked him that was a woman named Genevieve, in a city that no longer existed, in a language that no longer sounded the way it had when she spoke it. She'd asked it while he was sitting on the floor of a room they both knew she was dying in. Are you all right? She'd said, as if he were the one who needed care. As if the immortal creature who would outlive her by centuries were the fragile one. He had never forgotten the gentleness of it, the absurd, backwards kindness of a dying woman worrying about the man who couldn't die. That was 300 years ago. No one had asked since. His court asked after his strength. Julian asked after his safety. No one asked about his state of being. No one treated his well-being as a thing that mattered independent of his function. He sat down on the ledge. The stone was cold beneath him. He read the words again. 3 words, and they disarmed him more completely than anything had in 5 centuries. He typed, "No." Then, "I'm coming back." When he walked back into the bookstore 20 minutes later, Mira was sitting on a stool behind the counter, her hand neatly bandaged, reading a battered copy of Dracula she'd pulled from the shelf. She held it up when she saw him. "Research," she said. He looked at the cover. He looked at her. Something in his chest cracked open. "That book," he said, "is wildly inaccurate." "I figured." She set it down. "Damien, come sit." He sat on the stool next to hers. The clerk had tactfully retreated to the back room, either from social sensitivity or self-preservation. They were alone, surrounded by 10,000 books, under fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly worse than it was. "I'm sorry," he said. The word felt like a pebble thrown into a canyon. "For what? Leaving? You left to protect me. That's not an apology situation. That's a thank you situation? A weird one, but still." You didn't. Mira, you don't understand what that was." "I think I do." Her voice was gentle but firm. The same tone she used when a junior colleague was about to misfile something important. "It was the part of you that you manage every single day, that you've managed for 500 years, and it got hit with something unexpected and you handled it. By removing yourself from the situation. That is not a failure of control. That is control working exactly as designed." He stared at her. She looked back at him steadily, her bandaged hand resting on a copy of Dracula, sitting on a stool in a used bookstore at 11 o'clock at night, and she was not afraid of him. "The blood bags," he said, because he owed her the full truth. "They provide sustenance. They keep the hunger managed. But they have no life to them. It's the difference between a photograph of a meal and the meal itself. Your blood," he stopped, "has a scent," she finished. "A resonance. It's real. Like you said you were looking for." He could only nod. "So basically," she said, "you're on a very strict diet and I smell like pizza." A sound escaped him that he did not recognize. It was, he realized with some astonishment, a laugh, a real one, surprised out of him by the sheer absurd accuracy of her metaphor. "You," he said, "are extraordinary." "I'm an archivist who just compared herself to pizza. Let's not oversell it." He tried to end it 3 days later, not because of politics, not because of external threat, because he woke up from dormancy and the first thing he was aware of, before the blackout shields, before the silence of his empty apartment, before the familiar weight of his own solitude, was the memory of her scent. Not her perfume, not her shampoo, her blood. The way it had smelled in the bookstore. Iron and salt and something underneath that was purely, specifically, Mira. And the memory alone made his throat tighten. That was the thing that scared him. Not the incident itself, the aftermath. The fact that his body had filed it, cataloged it, wanted it. The hunger had tasted something real, and now it knew what it was missing. And that knowledge was not going to unknow itself. He sat in his darkened apartment and ran the numbers the way he always did, the math of these things. She would live, if she was fortunate, another 50 or 60 years. In that time, there would be more paper cuts. There would be kitchen accidents, scraped knees, nosebleeds, dental work. There would be 1,000 small, ordinary moments where her blood met air and his control met its limit. And he would have to win every single time. Every time. Because losing once was enough. End it, the rational part of him said. End it now, while it's still a wound and not a catastrophe. He went to her apartment. He stood on her fire escape in the dark, rehearsing the words. He had 5 centuries of eloquence at his disposal. He had ended alliances with grace and severed treaties with precision. He could do this. He could be kind and firm and final. Mira slid the window open. She was wearing a sweater that was too big for her and holding a mug of tea. Her hair was down and her reading glasses were perched on her nose, and she looked so alive it physically hurt him. "You have your ending things face on," she said. He blinked. What? "You've got the face. The noble, tortured, I'm doing this for your own good face. I've seen it in enough 19th century portraits to recognize it." She stepped back from the window. "Come inside. If you're going to break up with me, you're doing it where it's warm. I'm not having a pivotal emotional moment on a fire escape." He climbed through the window, feeling, absurdly, like a teenager. "How did you know?" "Damien, you have been progressively more distant for 3 days. You responded to my last text with a single period. A period. No one who is happily in a relationship responds with a period. That is the punctuation mark of existential despair." She sat on her couch, tucked her legs under her, and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts compassion and absolute refusal to make this easy for him. He sat in the chair across from her, not next to her. Distance. Safety. "The bookstore," he began. "Yes?" "I can still smell it, Mira. Your blood. The memory of it. It's filed now. My body knows what it's missing and I cannot unknow it." He leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees. "Every day I am near you, I am making a calculation. Every moment. How close I can be. How long I can stay. Whether the hunger is at a manageable level or whether I need to pull back, to create distance, to leave. And I will have to make that calculation every day for the rest of your life. And if I get the calculation wrong, even once, you're afraid you'll hurt me. I'm afraid I'll want to, and that the wanting will be louder than the loving." The words hung in the air of her small, warm apartment. Outside, the city murmured. Inside, the only sounds were the hum of her refrigerator and the slow tick of a wall clock. Human sounds, mortal sounds, the soundtrack of the life he was trying to give back to her. Mira set her tea down. She took off her glasses, folded them, placed them on the arm of the couch. Then she stood up, walked to the bookshelf beside the window, and pulled out a flat, rectangular object wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "Paper?" "It's a letter, written in 1862 by a woman named Ada Bracknell to a man named Thomas Garrity. I found it in a misfiled box at the archive 3 years ago. It had been lost for 160 years. She unwrapped it carefully, her hands steady and practiced, the way they always were with fragile things. Ada was sick. Consumption. She knew she was dying. Thomas was a sailor, gone for months at a time. She wrote this knowing she probably wouldn't be alive when he got home. She held it out to him. He could see the faded ink, the careful, slanting hand. The paper was thin as breath. "It's not sad," Mira said. "That's the thing people don't understand. It's not a sad letter." She tells him about the garden, about the cat who keeps sleeping on his pillow, about the terrible joke their neighbor told. She tells him ordinary things, because ordinary things are what you give someone when you want them to know you're still here, still real. She looked at him. She didn't spend her last letter being afraid of what was coming. She spent it being alive. Then she did something that stopped him cold. She held the letter out to him. To him, 160-year-old document, acid-free tissue and cotton glove territory. The kind of artifact she treated with more reverence than most people treated their own children. And she was placing it in the hands of the thing she knew could destroy it, could destroy her. His hands, which were cold and still and belonged to a predator who had just confessed he couldn't always tell hunger from love. He understood what she was doing. It was not a gesture. It was a proof. She was trusting him with the most fragile thing she owned, and she was doing it on purpose, and she was looking him dead in the eye while she did it. His fingers closed around the letter with the careful, aching gentleness of someone holding a life. The paper was thin as breath. He could feel the ghost of Ada Bracknell's hand in the texture of the ink, the slight indentations where her pen had pressed hardest. He held it, and he did not damage it, and Mira watched him not damage it, with an expression that said, "See?" She took the letter back after a moment and set it on the coffee table between them. "You want to leave because the math says I'll die and you'll remember. But Damien, that's the math for everyone. Every person who has ever loved another person has done it knowing it would end. The only difference between you and Thomas Garrity is that you know exactly how long the missing will last." He stared at the letter. 160 years old. Written by a dying woman to a man at sea. Full of gardens and cats and bad jokes. Ordinary things. Real things. "I'm not asking you to stop being what you are," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix the hunger or solve the math. I'm asking you to stay. Here, in this apartment that smells like tea and old books. With me." She paused. "And if you need to leave sometimes, if you need to step out because the hunger is too close, then you leave. And you come back. That's it. That's the whole arrangement. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it is straightforward." She picked up her tea. "Also, I should mention that I re-bandaged my hand with extra layers specifically because I knew you were coming over to break up with me, and I wanted to remove blood from the negotiating table. Literally." He looked at her hand. Neatly, thoroughly, almost comically over-bandaged. She had prepared for this. She had seen it coming, and instead of bracing for impact, she had problem-solved. Something broke in him. Not the hunger. Something older, harder, more calcified. The wall he had built between himself and the possibility that someone could know what he was. All of it. The hunger, the cold, the terrible math. And choose him anyway. Not despite it. Not because they didn't understand it. But with full, clear-eyed, over-bandaged knowledge of exactly what they were getting into. He moved from the chair to the couch. He sat beside her. Close. Closer than was safe, probably. She leaned into him, her warmth against his cold, and the temperature difference was so stark it was almost funny, like pressing your cheek against a window in December. "You over-bandaged your hand," he said, his voice rough. "I did." Because you knew I was coming to end it. Yep. And your strategy was extra gauze. My strategy was to remove variables from the equation so we could have a rational conversation. It's called methodology, Damien. I'm a professional. He put his arm around her. She fit against him the way she always did, warm and alive and smelling of tea and old books and the specific human scent that was hers alone. He could hear her heartbeat, 62 beats per minute, calm, sure. You are, he said quietly, the most terrifying woman I have ever met. I'm 5'4". Terror has nothing to do with height. She laughed into his shoulder, and the sound vibrated through him, warm and real, and he held her, and he did not leave. Later, much later, after the tea went cold and the city outside her window shifted from the hum of late evening into the deep quiet of 3 a.m., she picked up his phone from the coffee table. What are you doing? He asked, watching her with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned, over several months, that Mira with a phone was a woman with a plan. Updating your profile. He sat up. Mira, that thing is still active? You never deleted it? Damien, you have been on a dating app for months while dating me. That is a scandal. If Julian finds out... Julian must never find out. Julian is going to find out because I'm going to tell him, and the look on his face will sustain me through the winter. She was already typing. He watched her, helpless. What are you writing? She held up the phone, showing him the updated bio. Night owl, ancient soul, found someone real. He read it. He read it again. 3 short lines, replacing the 3 that had started everything. The same structure, the same simplicity. But the meaning had shifted, the way it does with the best callbacks. The ones where the same words become something entirely different because of everything that happened in between. You changed the last line, he said. The first 2 were already accurate. She set the phone down. Now it's all true. He looked at her. She looked at him. The apartment was quiet and warm and smelled of cold tea. His arm was around her and her head was against his shoulder, and outside the window the city was a grid of light, and somewhere in it 7 million hearts were beating, and he could hear them all, and hers was the one that mattered. It's all true, he agreed. She reached over and deleted the app entirely. Hey, you don't need it anymore, she said. Also, your main photo was from, 1987? The fountain? That collar was criminal. That collar was fashionable. In 1987. Damien, I love you, but that collar was a war crime. Constantinople was a war crime. The collar was fine. Julian told me about Constantinople. Julian tells you far too many things. Julian tells me exactly the right amount of things. He showed me a painting of you from the 1700s. The wig, Damien. Everyone wore wigs. Not everyone looked like an alarmed poodle. He stared at her. She grinned. And then they were both laughing. Real, stupid, breathless laughter. The kind that comes from being known. Truly known. Not the curated version. Not the 500-year-old mask of composure and dignity. But known. The wig. The collar. The man who survived plagues and empires, and was currently losing an argument about his fashion history to a 5'4" archivist who had once compared herself to pizza. The math hadn't changed. It never would. Somewhere ahead, at a distance he could calculate if he let himself, was the end of her. And beyond it, centuries of remembering. The weight of it was real, and it was permanent. And he would carry it the way he carried everything, alone, and for a very long time. But not yet. Right now, her heartbeat was 64 beats per minute. Right now, she was warm against his cold. Right now, she was laughing at his wig, and he was pretending to be offended. And Julian was somewhere in the penthouse Googling, "What is an emoji?" for the 3rd time this week. and the city was breathing its late-night breath, and everything was absurd and beautiful and real. He pressed his cold lips to the top of her warm head. She smelled of tea and paper and the lavender hand cream she used to keep her skin soft enough to handle old documents without damaging them. "Stay," she murmured, half asleep. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And for the first time in 500 years, he meant it.